So what happens after Dred Scott? Well, the thing that happens almost immediately after Dred Scott, it is an election. It's an election year. It's 1858, and during this election year, two individuals, Lincoln and Douglas, were running for the Illinois Senate, and both of them sort of had a series of debates that become fairly notorious in that they sort of set the stage for what was the conflict that was playing out nationwide. Um, Lincoln argued fairly forcefully during these debates that the only legally binding part of the Dred Scott decision was the immediate effect that it had on Scott and Sanford, and that everything else said by the Supreme Court was entirely irrelevant, which is to say that um, concerning the Missouri Compromise, like none of that was enforceable law because courts simply can't um, legislate in that area when the question's not posed to them. Um, Douglas, in turn, argued that while he detested slavery, and it's very true that Douglas did detest slavery. That's not um, a historical fancy or simply what he was saying at the time. Douglas was not pro-slavery, was not a fan of slavery, but he argues that he felt that the legislature of each territory and new state should be given the authority to decide for themselves, basically championing the idea of popular sovereignty. And this debate went on throughout Illinois and became popularized in publications at the time and became regular reading for individuals far outside of Illinois. Lincoln ultimately loses the debate in 1858, but you'll note that just 2 years later, after losing the Senate election, he wins the presidency of the United States. So one can think of his failed election of 1858 as sort of a launching platform for his rise to the presidency. And a lot of what was going on in the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the position that Lincoln was putting forward um, largely affected the Republican Party, who ultimately chooses to nominate him for their presidential candidacy. Um, Also in this time, Congress passes a law which abolishes slavery and declares all African American citizens. But it's symbolic, and it's only symbolic. And it's only symbolic for two main reasons. Um, First, Supreme Court decisions concerning constitutional interpretation can only be overruled by a constitutional amendment. Um, so they pass a law which abolishes slavery and declares all African American citizens. Well, you can't pass a law to overturn a constitutional interpretation of the United States Supreme Court. So one, they simply couldn't do it. And two, their successfulness was really kind of contingent upon the outcome of the Civil War. Um, so they were a little ahead of the game when they passed these laws. But as we all know, in terms of history, the United States wins the Civil War. The Union wins the Civil War, and very quickly after this, the Civil War amendments are passed. The Civil War amendments are as listed. So the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolishes slavery. So that which Congress could not do by simply statute, they do via a constitutional amendment. The 14th Amendment, passed 3 years later, ratified 3 years later, provides that for two main clauses that we should be interested in. One, everyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States and of the state they reside in. And second, that every individual has equal protection and due process that cannot be denied by any state. So to sort of take a path outside of what we're talking about just a little bit, this part of the 14th Amendment, that first prong, that everyone born in the United States is a citizen of the U.S. and the state they reside, it basically enforces what is known as birthright citizenship. so that individuals who were born on United States soil are American citizens. This was done not naively, which is to say that a lot of the argument today involving birthright citizenship has long left the confines in which it was created, which is to say that to ensure that African Americans had citizenship rights, and has moved to discuss citizenship of individuals who are born in the United States to individuals who aren't citizens of the United States. The drafters of this clause of the 14th Amendment absolutely knew and discussed the circumstances by which birthright citizenship is used today. That individuals will come into the United States to have children solely for citizenship. They discussed it. They debated it. They thought about it. And they ultimately settled on keeping the language exactly the way it was. So when we do debate the idea of founders' intent, it's not the founders of the original document. It's the founders of the 14th Amendment, the individuals who in the 1860s drafted the 14th Amendment, very clearly did intend for birthright citizenship to be a thing. Very specifically, individuals who were not citizens of the United States having a child in the United States, that child would have American citizenship. 100% intended by the individuals who wrote, drafted, and ultimately ratified the document. Moving on to the 15th Amendment, African Americans gained the right to vote, or should I say males who were African American above the age of voting within their given state had the right to vote. And also because of all of these, Congress was given the authority to enforce these amendments through all appropriate legislation. So Congress had the authority to reach out into the states if the states were, for example, violating equal protection or due process, and regulate the states and enforce the 14th Amendment. They had the authority to do the same thing with the 15th Amendment, though they really don't. What I mean is they really don't actually do it. They certainly have the authority, but they absolutely never really exercise it until the 1960s. But the first case that really sort of tests these amendments and tests primarily the 13th and 14th Amendment has absolutely nothing to do with slavery. And we've already covered this case a little bit in this class, and this is the second time around. And so the slaughterhouse cases, which we will do next, sort of sets the confines for what the court says the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment actually apply to.